Welcome, everyone, to the third annual LogiCal-LA conference. So let's be clear about what this conference is about, and what exactly is scientific skepticism. Briefly stated by Paul Kurtz, one of the giants of scientific skepticism, a skeptic is one who is willing to question any claim to truth, asking for clarity in definition, consistency and logic, and adequacy of evidence. The use of skepticism is thus an essential part of objective scientific inquiry and the search for reliable knowledge. Carl Sagan said, "Science is a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those of authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along." At the heart of this movement is the quest for truth using scientific inquiry. With so much pseudoscience, we need a methodology that can be used to tell us not if a claim is 100% true, but to examine if a claim is most likely true. In other words, to provisionally believe a claim is true until more compelling evidence is presented. Science and scientific research can and will improve our understanding of social issues as well. But there is one issue that is overriding all of these issues. It's climate change. We are placing the human race in a precarious position for future generations as we ignore the prognosis of the world as a whole. As the SGU, Skeptics Guide to the Universe, said several weeks ago on one of their podcasts, this generation is the one who must start to change our planet. It will be much more difficult for the future generations to make a significant change without doubling or tripling the cost to make that change. And most of the current world issues will diminish because all efforts will be placed on saving our planet. We should help other carbon-intensive countries change to a carbon-neutral energy sources. We hope you enjoy the stimulating lectures that our speakers have to offer.
Jemma Lorenat. Is that how you say your name, Jemma?
Yes.
Good enough? She's going to talk to us about how to see in 3D. Boy, I'm excited about this because, do I need glasses to watch what you're going to say? Or?
No.
Okay, very good. I'm very excited. I hope you are, ladies and gentlemen, Jemma. My pleasure. Have a good time.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invitation. I'm actually going to go back to my first slide. A little shorter than the previous speakers. So, I'm a historian of mathematics, and I'm going to be talking about the history of math. I look forward to the Q&A session because we're very rare historians of math, so you can ask all your history of math questions then. The title of this talk was meant to be somewhat provocative in that we live in the third dimension, so you might think that you see very well in 3 dimensions. You don't run into things, for instance, all the time. All the time, exactly. But it's actually a persistent question that's been raised throughout the thousands of years that we've had mathematics and specifically geometry. How do we represent 3-dimensional objects on paper, usually, or screens? And the larger point I want to make here is just an examination of objectivity was mentioned earlier, and mathematics is often seen as the most objective area of study, but even within objectivity, we have these subjective choices that can have really profound ramifications on our perception, on what knowledge is, on what facts are. So I think it's a valuable way to start a conference like this. Also, logic. Some people think math is the foundation of logic. Some people think logic is the foundation of math. So, but I'm going to be talking about geometry, not logic in particular. And just to begin with this quote, it's a very much an imaginative discipline. And so just to prepare you all for the next 20 odd minutes, I'm going to be asking you to use your imagination. So, 3 dimensions. Some things are very easy to represent in 3 dimensions. For instance, many of us can draw a badly drawn rectangular prism. I actually drew this by hand to illustrate the poorly drawn nature of it. But you have a sense, okay, we've been trained to look at this and see something three-dimensional. But it gets more complicated, and it gets more complicated quite quickly. So these are some polyhedra, just some early examples of more complicated polyhedra. They're both Keplerian solids, and you can see that as we advance into more complicated shapes, the process of seeing three dimensions becomes more difficult, and these aren't actually even very complicated. So just to give this idea that it becomes an intractable problem quite quickly. So what would be the advantage? Why does math even need to have representations of three-dimensional objects? I just want to give three different possible categories where mathematicians have asked questions that involve having a sense of what's happening in 3D. So the first is determining the relationship between vertices, edges, and faces. Not used to having a microphone where I can't walk around. I'm going to do some walking. So vertices, edges, and then faces, and you could count the vertices, edges, and faces and see the relationship between these objects for polyhedra. There's actually a really nice relationship there that's held constant for certain shapes. So that could be a question that a mathematician might ask about three-dimensional objects where you'd want to have this power of representing. Another question that's maybe even more obvious is finding what forms are made by intersecting objects in space. So here we have planes in space intersecting various three-dimensional objects, and then you're asking which ones, what shapes are made from that. And then another question that is pretty common in the history of mathematics, determining the set of all points satisfying a given property in space. So as a way of practicing our imagination, it's early, but hopefully you've had your coffee or caffeine equivalent or a good night's sleep, as we all wish, was something that was possible. So for instance, what is the set of all points that are equidistant from a given point? Yeah, so sphere. And so that's, again, a question that is well-defined mathematically and involves imagining something in space. I mean, you might know it's a sphere because you've memorized it's a sphere, but if you think, if I have a point, what are all the points in space that are going to be the same distance from that point, then you start to see, oh, that's a sphere. And so you're using your imagination and you're thinking about three-dimensional objects. It's helpful to have some sort of representation there. So these questions have been persistent throughout the history of mathematics, and various answers involving technology and techniques have been advanced to answer these questions. So I'm going to go through 7 different strategies. This is not a comprehensive list, but I think it gives a interesting scope, and you can see quite a lot of diversity and advantages and disadvantages between these different approaches. So first, avoidance. This is exemplified in the ancient Greek manuscript tradition. So if we look at some of the earliest texts we have on the study of three-dimensional geometrical objects, this does go before ancient Greece. There is the study of three-dimensional objects in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, but the textual tradition really begins in ancient Greece. And you can see here we have 2 circles. This is a drawing, but what's not represented here, and why I'm calling this avoidance, is these objects are actually supposed to be on a sphere. So this is the study of circles drawn on a sphere, but there's no attempt in these illustrations to give the sense of them being on a three-dimensional spherical object. They just look like flat circles. And so this would be the first approach, and this was the most widespread approach. And if, for those of you who are familiar, for instance, with art history, if you're looking at art from this time period, you're often seeing like a lack of perspective as well. And so this is carried over in the math tradition. And that, so just to draw on some work of other scholars in the history of math, the impression is that the manuscript diagram was meant to be read in conjunction with the text as referring to some other object. So the text is informing you, hey, this is on a sphere, even though it doesn't look like it's on a sphere. Or they're actually supposed to be a real sphere in which the teacher would be drawing circles on some sort of physical object. But it's speculative because those sorts of material objects no longer exist. Jumping forward in history, looking at the 15th, 16th, 17th century, we have the introduction of systematized mathematical treatments of perspective or projection. So this is from a French text on perspective, and you can see, for instance, There. We have a 1-point perspective. We have a vanishing point where the lines are going to. So there's some effect of, this is sort of like the figure I began with. You have a sense of, oh yeah, this looks like a drawing of a 3-dimensional object. Another form of perspective, and just to point out, the symmetries between math and art in this period are not all accidental. You have many of the same practitioners advancing geometrical practices and advancing practices in painting. So De La here worked from this math text in creating this painting, and actually these screens are extremely high quality, so you might even be able to see the mathematical forms on the paper that's being held up in the painting. And then another form of seeing in 3 dimensions is orthogonal projections. So here you have, and gesturing is absolutely necessary here, so you have 2 perpendicular planes, and you have an object in space, and you project onto both of those flat planes, and then you open them up, and then you have a flat image. And so this is just an illustration of that, and this is something that was actually a military secret for the French, and so it was actually seen as an extremely valuable piece of technology for engineering, and a very efficient way of representing 3-dimensional objects on paper, which was a crucial question in this time period. And so the person who created this geometry, Gaspard Monge, he just introduced this by saying that the point of this area of study is to provide methods for representing on a sheet of paper that has 2 dimensions, length and width, all the bodies of nature that have 3 dimensions, never neglecting these bodies must be defined rigorously. And then also, inversely, working from paper to 3 dimensions. And as I was illustrating by trying to gesturally point out how this kind of projection works, this was again a very active form of teaching in trying to convey these objects, because when you're working with paper, you also need this supplement of like a person explaining to you how to work with the paper, right? If you don't have this instruction, then these kinds of drawings are going to be meaningless to you. But at the same time, figures are getting more and more complicated, even with this practice of orthogonal projection onto 2 planes. And so there's this sentiment in the mathematical community, can we transcend the limits of the figure? So Shaw is complaining about the assistance to the figures, whose real convenience, even when their construction is easy, is at least to tire the spirit and exhaust the mind, which is maybe the way some of you have felt in math classes. And so this idea that can we get away from figures? And one way to get away from figures, which maybe also tires the spirit and exhausts the mind, is analytical geometry, the use of coordinate equations. And so you lose all aspect of the visual correspondence here, but it is a very succinct way of representing 3-dimensional objects through assigning some sort of coordinates in space and then creating variables and constants and using equations. So that's another method that's happening at the same time. And while this might seem quite far from this figurative practice, in fact, some of the practitioners saw their work as very figure-oriented. So the German geometer Plücker commented on his development of geometry using equations that one needs only to consider that we never lose sight of the given figures, although here the symbols represent them. So he really saw these equations as figures and as visual objects, even though we might see them as abstract. They're abstract visual objects. Okay, so this leads to an untranslatable German term, Vorstellungskraft, means roughly the power of representing before your mind. So this form of imagination, but it's it's basically the capability of representing something in your mind's eye. And I think the German word's actually more succinct in this instance, so I'm sticking with that. And so rather than working from a figure, you might simply use your imagination. And this was advanced by a contemporary of Plücker, Jakob Steiner. And so he began his text looking at these 2-dimensional objects, but then when he advanced to 3 dimensions, he claimed that they're only properly understood if they're intuited purely without any sensory media, only through the inner Vorstellungskraft. So only using your power of imagination are you actually going to get a sense of what these 3-dimensional objects look like. And again, this is going to involve a huge amount of training. Just to give an example, of this. So he says that this has to happen. If you try to circumvent this, it's only going to work so far. And instead of your active imagination becoming healthy and strong, it's going to fall into darker, more difficult views. And then you can, read his. I just wanted to have an excerpt to sort of show what he was talking about. I'm not going to go into any of this detail, but I just wanted to point out that, so this is the text you would be working with, and from this kind of text, you are then creating this mental object that you are then manipulating in your mind. And this is what Steiner, among other mathematicians and teachers of math and engineers, saw as the best way to see things in 3 dimensions, was simply to develop this mental capacity to visualize things. And while this seems quite difficult, and it was agreed to be difficult, it was also celebrated in his time. So Geiser, writing a biography of Steiner, points out that his lectures were particularly interesting because of his original diction, which made everything he taught very graphic. Pupils did not have to draw out shapes, in particular 3-dimensional ones. Instead, they could see them in their mind's eye purely because of the description. So he's doing such a good job conveying orally these concepts that everyone is imagining these objects and being able to manipulate them without any sort of visual aid. And then this was adopted by engineers as being a very valuable tool, because engineers are working from things like this, where you have some visual aid, but really you need this mental representation power to go from these 2-dimensional sketches to something that's actually going to be physically built in space. And so this was seen as a very useful, practical tool, this power of imagination. And also, the principal object of geometrical instruction in this time period, and this may be surprising to some of you, I mean, it really depends on your own geometrical upbringing. Geometry now is often taught as a way of understanding logical arguments, like proofs are introduced in geometry classes now, but during the 19th century, geometry was actually seen as a way of developing your power of mental representation, which is something that, at least in my own experience, is not how I learned geometry, but it'd be interesting maybe in Q&A to hear if other people had more of that visually oriented geometrical upbringing. But it was seen as why would you learn geometry? Because you can then see things in space. And then just to bring it to an American commentator, this is on a translation or a review, and he says, the most powerful pleas of the greatest of recent mathematicians have been made for visualization. It is to be hoped that the present beautiful volume will mark in English-speaking countries also a distinct stage in the progress towards this goal. So again, visualization being why you would learn math. Okay, Steiner was actually, so he's Swiss, and he was a student of Pestalozzi, who is a famous pedagogue at the same time period. And you may or may not have heard of Pestalozzi, but you probably actually, well, I won't jump the gun. I'll just get to why he's important. So Steiner took Pestalozzi's teaching in a very imaginative way without visual aids, but if you look at Pestalozzi's original text, he's saying that it's good to have these visual objects brought before our eyes so that you're gathering things from this evidence-based approach to looking at these visual objects, rather than just the mention of a name. And along with Steiner, Pestalozzi's other very famous student was Froebel, who created the concept of kindergartens. And so Froebel took this, again, this idea of how do we represent 3-dimensional objects, and he used physical manipulatives. So that's the next category I want to look at. So these are just Froebel's gifts. These were part of a kindergarten sequence in the original concept of kindergarten that was then imported and exported all over the world. And so working with blocks as a crucial step towards developing spatial literacy in students. But models can be made of many other things, so I just want to go through some of the different material models, because, well, actually they're quite beautiful, and it's interesting to see how different materials at the same time were used for models. So these are actually paper models of polyhedra, and when you bought this set, they would actually be flat nets, and you would cut them out and fold them up, and then you'd have this box of polyhedra. An advantage to this is it's very affordable compared to wood or metal or plaster, but it's limited in that you can only make certain things out of a flat piece of paper, right? You can't make a sphere, for instance. Another material form models were these string models. This is brass and wire, and so these could show more complicated figures. They're I mean, kind of obviously more expensive. This is a circular hyperboloid, but you can see you have this sort of angle. You would need something other than paper. And some of these string models actually you could manipulate by twisting them, and so seeing different variations on these forms. But the most popular form of models in the 19th century were these plaster models. And in fact, if you look at any sort of mathematical space from this time period, you're going to see the plaster models featured in the space. And this was on purpose. So Felix Klein was a German mathematician who was very influential in the mathematical community in the United States in the early 20th century. And he used models to make room for mathematics. So mathematicians had seminars, but these were usually not physical spaces. And so the use of these physical models created the need for a space for mathematicians, and then they could have a place where they gathered and they had their books. And so this was actually quite transformative with respect to the practice of math as it being something that needs a specific location, equivalent perhaps to like a laboratory in the natural sciences. And so this is an example from Johns Hopkins, and you can see their books, and then you can see the plaster models over in the other case. And so this is something, if you try to find pictures of mathematicians or mathematical spaces from this time period, the models are going to be a key feature. And then someone mentioned three-dimensional glasses. Yes, these were used in the practice of mathematics, which is kind of amusing to think about. I would love to find a picture of a classroom where all the kids are doing math and wearing 3D glasses. That'd be incredible. But this was a really popular book produced in the early 20th century, and it's a geometry text that comes with a pair of 3D glasses. And it was to see these three-dimensional objects in space. And this is just an excerpt from the text, just different ways of viewing these objects, talking about this practice of seeing in 3D, the creation of anaglyphs. And it was received as a very economical way to represent these objects. It's going to be much more affordable than these plaster models, for instance. And so the reviewer said the mathematical world, especially that part of it concerned in teaching, are therefore greatly indebted to the production of this text. I mean, I wish it took off. Again, during Q&A, it'd be fascinating if someone actually learned math using 3D glasses, but I have no evidence that it was widely adopted despite its economy. And then today, and I'm a historian of the 19th century, so I can't say very much about today, but digital technology, right? So now, and I think we're all actually much more familiar with the various forms of augmented reality, virtual reality. Even, if you were to look up any polyhedra online, you would have digital models of these shapes, and then they're manipulable, and you have this facility that's not possible until this time period. But I think while it's easy to see the advantages, there are also some interesting limitations about it not being something tangible. So in closing, which one to choose? Why does it matter, right? We have these various options of seeing three-dimensional objects in space. Why choose one over another, and how does it affect our perception? So just to jump out of the realm of mathematics for a while and think about the choice of images, I just wanted to visit media studies and consider the role of images, but specifically within the context of this objective science of mathematics, because I think it equally well applies in mathematics, although we tend to think of mathematics as not something where the choice of representation matters. So for instance, images are not passive entities that coexist with their human hosts any more than the microorganisms that dwell in our intestines. They change the way we think and see and dream. They refunction our memories and imaginations, bringing new criteria and new desires into the world. And so our mathematical imagination is changing with our choice of material representation of these objects. And then again, drawing on this concept of imagination, how do we develop our imagination? So with respect to reading, I think there's much more literature on this. So for instance, children read picture books, preteens read chapter books with pictures, eventually young adults graduate to books made up entirely of words. This process exists because we learn to read a language slowly, in stages, though I wonder if we also need, over time, to learn how to picture narratives unassisted. And likewise, if you wanted to be able to picture geometric objects unassisted, you would need to go through this same gradual process. So the implication being that our imaginations can and do improve over time. So practicing imagining will create a facility for imagining. On the other hand, there are cognitive scientists who question the value of imagining in drawing logical inferences. So I just wanted to put this counterpoint out there, that while imagining it can be a beautiful, wonderful thing, it's not necessarily going to make you more logically efficient. And so some studies have been done to test this hypothesis, that relations that elicit visual images containing details that are irrelevant to an inference should impede the process of reasoning. The phenomenal experience of the image, in other words, gets in the way of reasoning. And the way they tested this was they looked at really simple syllogisms. So for instance, like the cat is bigger than the dog is bigger than the chicken, is the cat bigger than the chicken? I just made that up and I'm not listening to myself, so I have no idea what the right answer is. But bigger, you can, if you're imagining this, you can see like, oh, here's a small animal, bigger animal, and their argument was the seeing of it can lead to distracting details, like, wow, what a fat chicken. I've never seen a chicken that big, but that has nothing to do with the logical inference. And so because your imagination is sort of giving you unnecessary information, it's slowing you down in drawing a logical inference. And so they ran tests on this. I'm a little skeptical of their tests. I mean, I teach statistics. Their sample size was really small, and it consisted entirely of Princeton students. So I don't know how much they represent the general population. It seems like a sample of convenience, but it was published. So, but it's an interesting, regardless of the validity of their experiment, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. You know, is our imagination giving us more than we need? Just enough? Not enough? I mean, what are we getting from that visualization? But then counter to this, how does using visual aids help us reason? And so this is more a question of mental capacity. And so this is Thinking with External Representations by David Kirsch. To solve a geometric problem, we might imagine a structure and reason about it internally. And this is Steiner's thing, right? Using your Verstandeskraft. We might work with an illustration and project extensions and possibilities. At some point, though, the cost of projection becomes prohibitive. By creating external structures that anchor and visually encode our projections, we can push further, compute more efficiently, and create forms that allow us to share thought. So this being an argument in favor of some sort of tangible resource rather than just using our mind's eye. So I just want to conclude with this argument, thinking about mathematics. Even in mathematics, which is perhaps the most objective human pursuit, the choice of technique or technology does change what we see, what we can do, and how we think about objects. And then a question maybe to consider in your own life is how do you practice imagining today without, if you aren't thinking about polyhedra all the time, which maybe some of you are, and like congratulations. But in what ways are you developing your imagination as a skill? And is this something that we as a society think is still an important practice, the practice of three-dimensional imagination? And maybe the answer is no. You know, maybe we've offloaded this into a digital realm and we don't need to practice imagination anymore, just like we don't need to calculate tips because people use their phones. And I think that actually that argument comes up much more often. People say like, oh, don't rely on your phone, we should learn arithmetic. But an argument I at least haven't heard as much is the argument of we should be working on these geometrical processes, which frankly I think are much more interesting than adding and subtracting. So with that, thank you so much for your time and attention.